When one distances oneself from the covering official narrative and understands exactly what happened at the murder site, and the strange activities around the Palm couple all that evening, all the other puzzle pieces fall into place. That witnesses observed events around the couple that in broad strokes completely contradict the statements Lisbeth and son Martin later gave, one understands that unfortunately they have been part of the cover-up. Now that Theo has been so grossly erased from the entire course of events, despite the clear differences in description between the grand man and the man the couple met at the advertising pillar, compared to the ice-cold slaughterer, the professional killer from southern Africa who stood waiting for several minutes at the Dikarima corner, one at least understands who was involved in activities around the murder site. Add the obvious persons who later were shown in strangely witness-luring revealing ways on state television, and you get a clear picture of how large the activity was and who was involved in different parts of the murder evening. Add to that approximately 80 different witness observations, from various people, about men with walkie-talkies around the Palm couple and places they would later pass, at the same time as the Palm fake investigation does everything to diminish and wave away these observations, which of course had nothing to do with the South African perpetrators. One understands much more about how this could have happened. Because there is no reasonableness in the coincidence that at the same time as the execution is carried out by the ice-cold professional killer from southern Africa, a top-secret stay-behind exercise is taking place. Led by the Swedish Security Service with support from resources from the former Säpo chief and now county police chief in Stockholm, Hans Holmer. When one also understands that the South African regime's agents around Europe have carried out acts on behalf of Western security services, many against the communist ANC, one also understands that the South African regime never could have carried out the act without both a clear green light from Western leadership at the highest level and without a cover from the at the time top-secret Western NATO-founded stay-behind organization. One understands how high up this act has its anchoring. Here too there are concrete and factual statements around the murder from a whistleblower in the USA, Gene Chip Tatum, who in a radio interview revealed what he was told in connection with becoming involved in OSG, the secret American organization that carried out operations to murder prominent and problematic persons and cause regime changes around the world. Statements that clearly pointed to the order to execute the Swedish Prime Minister, coming from George Bush Sr., and carried out by South African agents. Which was exactly what happened. We listened to that clip.
Was Bush involved in any complicity with that? Was it the foreign minister who was killed in Sweden?
Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was assassinated. I'm told it was by the OSGs, and they used an asset out of southern Africa.
I see. So, and why was he neutralized?
End user certificates that were very important during the Iran-Contra, what they call the Iran-Contra, for the weapons that were being shipped around the world. Mm-hmm. Without an end user certificate, it's very difficult to move the weapons into areas without violating international law and ending up in prison. So they needed end user certificates for a lot of these upgraded weapons rather than just the M16s. Sweden was a primary area to use it because there was a weapons company out of Sweden that North wanted to use. So, from what I understand, he laid the whole plan out to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister wouldn't have anything to do with it and was going to turn it over to the international community because it was illegal.
Mm-hmm. And that was his undoing.
And it's historic now. Yeah.
According to whistleblower Chip George Bush Sr., who was also CIA chief for a period, ordered the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. Considering that Carl Colby, son of William Colby who laid the foundation for Stay Behind in Sweden already in the 1950s, has stated that he heard there was an exercise taking place in Stockholm on the murder evening at the same time, there is no doubt that this exercise very well could have been the cover for the attack itself. William Colby later also became CIA chief, as many probably already know. There is also a peace researcher, Ola Tunander, who with his insight into how Stay Behind operated in different countries during the Cold War, has also confirmed that many acts and regime changes took place under the cover of Stay Behind exercises. Tunander has also accounted for how the Swedish Security Service conducted an investigation of the course of events around the murder site itself and concluded that the scenario resembles a coup defense exercise, an execution attempt, on an information carrier one needs to liquidate. Which is also what explains the visible policeman at the murder site a while before the murder who was identified by the so-called Finns. Everything thus indicates that it was this person who acted as the planned scapegoat, or patsy, in the exercise scenario on the murder evening. Especially as he over his walkie-talkie received the order to continue with the mission despite being recognized at the murder site, minutes before the shots. The starting point is that even he was completely unaware of what was really going to happen in connection with the Palm couple passing the Dikarima corner, and the ice-cold slaughterer going into action. So it was never a question of coincidence, with the simultaneous exercise. All of this is also evidenced by the last phone call Olof Palme made on the murder evening before the couple went to the cinema, which was precisely a call to Sven Aspling, who was a member of Stay Behind, and it is obvious that it may have concerned a final check before the evening's activities, in connection with the exercise. Just as hinted in statements, there was a purely private reason for the meeting between the Palme couple taking place where it did, outside Dikarima on the way home from the cinema. This meeting can thus very well have been provoked via threats from Craig and his South African colleagues, since Craig himself stated that the act was about dirty arms deals and that Olof, in connection with this, handled black money. In connection with this short meeting, a stay behind exercise was thus arranged on the murder evening, and one of the advantages was to avoid Palme having bodyguard protection that could jeopardize the operation. And that Olof himself so carelessly would have gone to a dangerous meeting with his wife this cold late February evening, without a single thought that something bad could happen, can be explained by Olof trusting Theo and the entire Stay Behind organization, and with all the resources that Swedish security services provided. That is why throughout the investigative work it has been emphasized that no Swede is reasonably involved or aware of the planned execution. At the time of the murder in Sweden in the 80s, it would have been more or less unthinkable that an authority representative could have been involved. Regardless of whether it looks like Western security services, from 1982, deep in cooperation with the Swedish Security Service and a specific selected police traveled to South Africa on guerrilla combat trainings, via the International Police Association's direction to, in accordance with Stay Behind's operations, being able to operate in the country after a potential Soviet takeover. It is also here that naive statements from government representatives fit in so well with what actually happened, that they really did not see it coming when everyone was completely set on how already Western aligned Sweden, Swedish military, and security services were. That Sweden unofficially was already the 17th NATO member at the time of the murder. And as Michael Holmström has written about in his book, that a high-ranking Swedish military person already during the murder night was prepared to travel to the West to continue defending Sweden if it was about a Soviet invasion that began with a prime minister murder. He was just waiting for clearance from the government, which revealingly never came because they knew it was the West behind it. It is also here that one easily gets a reasonable explanation for how the vice prime minister just takes a taxi into the city, without more serious protection. Why police at the murder scene tell something completely different to other police than what really happened and who was affected. So the only remaining question about why the Western powers, with George Bush Sr. at the helm, would have ordered a murder of a secretly allied leader of Palme's stature in the world, at the time of the murder? Why would Swedish government representatives, authorities, and media do everything to cover up the murder and at the same time put the entire Swedish democratic legal system out of play, in something that even explains Holmer's statement that Swedish society will change fundamentally? Why has no other political force in Sweden over the years wanted to reveal what really happened during the 40 years that the entire Swedish establishment has covered up the murder, and offered Swedish lone madmen as accused perpetrators, on a conveyor belt? What is it that makes that just hours after the murder, Swedish police begin deliberate activities in the hunt to pin a completely innocent for the murder, precisely in line with the scapegoat Lee Harvey Oswald in the John F. Kennedy murder? What is the motive that it was only about Olof Palme and nothing more? Just as it has already been accounted for in the context during the Cold War, there were many possible reasons and motives to limit Olof Palme's voice and engagement in the world. There is probably no one who did not understand what impact Palme had in the world, especially the voice for the weak and vulnerable that he stood up for. The fight against the oppression from the apartheid regime in South Africa as an example. Others have highlighted the corrupt arms trade with India as a possible cause. Palme's impending meeting with the Soviet Union's leader Gorbachev and negotiations about nuclear-free zones have also been cited as possible reasons. Different theories that have been named, traitor track, in connection with military submarine violations in Swedish waters during the 80s. The problem is just that the concrete information around who could have arranged a top-secret stay-behind exercise as cover for the execution, and that Swedish government representatives choose to just smooth over and cover up the entire murder, makes that it only can be Western security services behind the murder itself. And when it comes to political leaders in Western countries, and specifically in the case of a Swedish democratically elected prime minister, who is even considered to belong to the West at the time of the murder, even if they officially pretend to play neutral, one understands that the motive should be serious and in some form well-founded, even conveyed in precise threats. It is precisely here that the fantastic whistleblower Arnold Sundquist's story from 2022 confirms most of what reasonably lay behind the murder itself, especially in the clear threats directed from American top level against Olof Palme personally on several occasions. It is also a fantastic story from reality from a person whose life is unique, in the context and in what way this person chose to tell about the dramatic events shortly before the murder on the Prime Minister. It was thus in connection with the Swedish Social Democratic Defense Minister going after a newer party and referring to their previous history that Arnold chose to go out with what the Social Democrats had been involved in before. Everyone should of course listen to Arnold's own story themselves, in its entirety, but to at least pick out the most essential, here is a short summary. Arnold, as export controller for American account, was asked to go to Sweden and find out if Bofors delivered weapons with American components to active wars in the Middle East. Arnold with his contacts went to Bofors' office and got serial numbers on the Robot 70 that had been exported abroad. After American military sank a fast Iranian patrol boat in the Persian Gulf of Swedish manufacture, they could confirm that both boats, but mainly a Bofors-manufactured Robot 70, had the same serial numbers as those Bofors exported. They dug further, and then found that Robot 70 was exported via a police chief in Malaysia, via a Swedish company where the rulers were former Sapo chiefs and also a high-ranking social democrat, and that the whole arrangement was created by Olof Palme himself, to be able to decoy smuggle Robot 70 to the now warring nation Iran. These fast patrol boats with Volvo engines manufactured by Bogomars on Ladingo, with high-tech Robot 70 with American components, thus did great damage to ship traffic in the Persian Gulf during 1985. When this was revealed, American authorities and embassy contacted Olof Palme personally and pointed out both this and that Sweden helped Gaddafi in Libya build a submarine harbor, attached with a list of all the people they knew were involved, which was not something the Americans looked brightly on. They also knew that money went to activities on the Americans' backyard in South America, and they were not happy with that. Here in connection with this also comes concrete and relevant information in the problems with Palme's dirty secret activities, namely the specific threats that were conveyed to Olof Palme personally. Namely that if not Palme stopped what he was doing, then the last Volvo car was sold in the USA. Viggen will not lift again, and the planned new fighter plane JS Gripen will never happen. Considering it was during the Cold War days. Considering how much money Swedish car and arms manufacturing contributed to Sweden's prosperity, these threats of measures were completely devastating for Sweden, if they became reality. It was also not a question of any negotiation but just clear instructions, that should be followed to the letter, otherwise the measures would be carried out. It also says a lot about what relation Sweden, but also the Prime Minister, had to the current American administration. Palme of course did what was expected of the Americans, but as Arnold also fills in with later in his story, about what happened a time afterward, there is an obvious continuation, that it is these dirty arms deals that may have been the basis for the Americans getting totally tired of Palm's actions that they had previously been so clear about how they wanted handled. Information is known that there was an order from Iran for 400 Robot 70 from Bofors. First, only half was delivered during 1985, and information indicates that during December 1985 there was a plan to deliver the rest of the weapons to Iran, and one of the measures from Palm then became to act and dirtily accuse Arnold for industrial espionage, just because Arnold cheekily had stepped into the office at Bofors and got the serial numbers he asked for. It is that story that Arnold later tells about in his review, and how he had to hide in his underground helicopter hangar for the sent Swedish security police was hunting him. And that Arnold then managed in a remarkable way to get via boat to Denmark, and then in safety to the USA. Once there, Arnold told what he had been subjected to, and then the American administration contacted Olof Palme once again, and in this position it was just clear orders about what Olof should do around the handling of Arnold, and that it was clear that no one in Sweden could do anything bad to Arnold in the future. But what also revealingly decides a possible intent and motive is the demand that more people from the Swedish government were required to be involved and aware of the arisen situation this time. Here it becomes obvious, with this whole background as basis, that Palme more or less signed his own death sentence, and that it was therefore that other influential governing people should be present as a possible preparation for what later would happen to Palme. That no one would be able to question what Palme himself had caused, and that there were clear motives for why the American administration could no longer have an allied partner who refused to comply with the demands the American administration made on, among others, the countries that bought American components, developed advanced war material, and earned big money from it. According to Arnold, the last mentioned event would have taken place the month before Palme was executed, and here the order and the green light should reasonably have gone out to South Africa via the Italian P2 Lodge to carry out the assassination and then mask it in a simultaneous stay-behind exercise. First, after provoking a meeting between Theo and Palme, that Palme himself planned and placed outside illuminated diorama, on the way home from an already booked movie. It is here the explanations that the victim himself chose the murder place get their long-awaited reasonable explanation. Considering it was the Swedish security police who held the exercise during the murder night, and that there was already personnel in the police's liaison center at the time of the murder, it is not so difficult to understand that also information about a secret Sapo exercise that was going on the murder evening named Così fan tutte, after an opera by Mozart, could be the name of just the exercise that happened around the Palme couple when he anyway would meet his friend Theo from Crete. The hushed events outside the cinema after the film, when a person acted threateningly against the Prime Minister, that a prosecutor threateningly hushed down, also indicate that it may have been part of the exercise. One absolutely did not want to come forward. Arnold's entire story and the content in it about the big problem with the fast Swedish patrol boats with harmful weapons in the Persian Gulf is also confirmed by the former employee in the American administration, Barbara Honegger, in her book, October Surprise, where she, in the chapter with the Swedish contact, accounts for the fast boats that caused great damage in the Persian Gulf. A book that is also quoted in one of the covering Swedish commissions over the years, but where the message about who should be the recipient of the telegram, that referred to it being clear that the Swedish tree would be felled, i.e. that Palme would be executed, revealingly has been edited away from the original message. When the recipient himself, Vice President Bush, has been removed. Which also gives evidence for how the Swedish commission works, that have been done around the murder, only have been about calming the public, which even one of the commission participants has stated, to seriously scrutinizing people. To also underline how credible and experienced the helicopter pilot and adventurer Arnold Sundqvist is as an informant, he has also been personal advisor to the current American President Donald Trump. And when one looks at all revealing reactions that also give evidence that a story is relevant and revealing, Arnold himself has stated that American CIA did not become happy that the whistleblower Arnold went out publicly and told about the thoroughly corrupt decoy smuggling deals that a very active Swedish arms selling and warmongering Prime Minister was doing at the time of the murder. That he even tried to silence Arnold through invented serious criminal accusations. really dirty arms sales that went to warring nations, that at this time were against all Swedish rules for arms export. All this information is also well described and as evidence in the article that New York Times journalist Richard Reeves reported about just over a year after the murder. About how decisive and income-bringing the dirty arms deals were for Sweden as a country, and how involved Swedish prime ministers were in acting as arms dealers at the time of the murder. The trail of events that was effectively closed to investigators began in November 1980. Olof Palme, who had been defeated in the 1976 election, was bored and irritable as opposition leader. He missed the world spotlight that had played on him as a vehement opponent of the Vietnam War. He jumped when United Nations Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim asked him to try to mediate the bloody war between Iran and Iraq, then a year old. Until 1983, the year after he won re-election as Prime Minister, Palme continued to make trips to Iran and Iraq, shuttling between Tehran and Baghdad with an entourage from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Many of those diplomats stayed on in the warring capitals. Their presence led to the later suspicion that the government must have known of weapons shipments to Iran by Sweden's great arms manufacturer, the Bofors Group of Nobel Industries. Swedish law prohibits sales by Bofors and other private arms companies in war zones, which by Swedish definition includes much of the world, certainly the Persian Gulf and the entire Middle East. But Sweden is also a country that maintains its high standard of living. Per capita income is 25% higher than in the United States through foreign trade. Arms sales are part of that prosperity. Weapons may account for 5% or more of Sweden's annual exports of about $45 billion, which is more than a third of its gross national product. The government has been known to look the other way on weapons sales, liberally granting export permits that certified that material was not headed for war zones. Singapore was the favored shipping point for Bofors equipment, especially its highly regarded RBS-70 surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile launcher. From that port, the RBS-70s were sent on to, among other places, Iran, being transshipped a second time from Dubai or Bahrain. Then someone inside Bofors blew the whistle, leaking information on the deals to peace groups on the left wing of Palme's Social Democrats. Details began to leak out about a series of shipments between October of 1984 and May of 1985, apparently all headed toward Iran. Trainloads of Bofors gunpowder had been seized by customs officers in West Germany and Italy. Other trainloads and perhaps naval cannons had gotten through by way of Austria, Yugoslavia, and Singapore. 200 RBS-70s had been delivered to Iran, part of an order for 400 placed by the Iranian government. An additional 800 to 1,200 RBS-70s could not quite be accounted for, although they were known to have passed through Dubai and Bahrain. Directors of Bofors have insisted that the company has done nothing that was illegal or that was not known to the government. Palme, facing re-election in 1985, appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the sales. And he stopped the shipments at least for a time. Specifically, he blocked the 200 additional RBS-70s that Iran had ordered. Also, according to sources in the French Foreign Ministry, the Swedish Prime Minister ordered a ship loaded with 155mm howitzers stopped as it was leaving the port of Malmö bound for Dubai, and then, it is believed, Iran. An Iranian military delegation came to Stockholm to protest the stopping of deliveries. That was on February 4, 1986, 3 weeks before Palme's murder. The Iraqis, of course, had protested the sales when they became public. They were also enraged by a program that the Swedes considered an act of humanitarian neutrality. Iranian war wounded were being treated in Swedish hospitals for what the Iranians said were the effects of poison gas attacks launched by Iraq. It has also in recent years, when the Palme fake investigation has also found interest in bringing forward South Africa's involvement in the murder, existed concrete information that the Swedish state and government in South Africa chosen to put the lid on this entire event, despite there having been ideas to negotiate amnesty for the crimes, with the involved South Africans, against them actually telling what happened on the murder evening and around the murder. Which obviously was what the last prosecutor Christer Peterson was on the way to achieve. In connection with him in February 2020 later would return with decision in prosecution question, which never can have been about an already deceased perpetrator. At the same time as he initially never even talked about closing the investigation. A prosecutor who previously made clear that he intended to drive the investigation all the way to retirement, which then would have been this year 2026. And once you come to understand what unlawful violations the cover-up of the murder has been guilty of, you get the explanation for all the other quotes that have surrounded the investigation over the years. One can also understand both Palm's actions and what he believed in, but at the same time how it caused major problems for the West in controlling conflicts and events during the challenging days of the Cold War. One also understands the difficulty of explaining the background to the murder, with a prime minister acting as an arms seller, via front smuggling to warring countries and exposing Sweden to incredibly large risks in this dirty profitable trade. That Sweden was in principle already the 17th member of NATO, and that the top-secret stay-behind network had existed in Sweden for several decades, and that the person who built up that organization was a prominent person within the CIA. One can act with hindsight and speculate on whether the truths could have emerged earlier, if only one had played incompetent and naive, even in the investigative work. It is even possible to believe that understanding Swedes in general might have accepted a truth about the cover-up after a number of years, especially since the top-secret stay-behind organization became known in Sweden a few years after the murder. It is also understandable that the early measures of deliberately and intentionally pointing out, and in one case both prosecuting and convicting, a completely innocent person for the murder in a Swedish court, were what prevented the truth about the cover-up from coming out, without the entire Swedish establishment paying the price for what they had been involved in. But as most can now see, all of these explanations for what happened, by naive Swedish politicians, have already been addressed in all the information surrounding the fake investigation over the years. What is undoubtedly suggested in the concrete threats that investigative public figures received in writing, in connection with the concrete threats they were sent. It also leads us to who has been involved in the continued cover-up of the murder, and how such revealing actions have been carried out in many of the forums available for people interested in the murder over the years. This is where we return to parallels with many other ongoing murder cover-ups, such as the murder of Charlie Kirk, which is still ongoing in the aftermath, in alternative media.